has Trump's election victory been perceived in Israel?
Well, I think he's extremely popular in Israel. I think he would win the prime ministership if he ran for office in Israel. I think he's more popular than Benjamin Netanyahu, certainly. I think Israel is one of the most supportive of Trump compared to the other countries in the Middle East, certainly, but I would say also worldwide.
Hello, and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy, produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editor-in-chief. On today's program, we're going to be discussing U.S.-Israeli relations and the incoming Trump administration. We'll be covering how U.S. policy may change under the new government, the outlook for Israeli politics in 2025, and the prospects for advancing peace on the Israeli-Palestinian front. You can subscribe to Middle East Focus on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast providers. We've got a lot to discuss, but thankfully I'm joined today by two great guests to help us make sense of things, Nimrod Goren and Ilai Saltzman. Nimrod is the Senior Fellow for Israeli Affairs at the Middle East Institute, president of MITVIM, the Israeli Institute for Regional Foreign Policies, and co-founder of Diplomeds, the Council for Mediterranean Diplomacy. Ilai is an associate research professor of Israel Studies and the director of the Gilderhorn Institute for Israel Studies at the University of Maryland, College Park. Nimrod, Ilai, welcome to the program, and thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
We're going to focus, for the most part today, on the incoming Trump administration, but I want to start off first with a couple of questions about the outgoing one under President Joe Biden. We've got a little over 2 months left. What steps do you think the Biden administration could take in that time to advance the prospects for peace or to address the wars in Gaza and, of course, in Lebanon as well?
The Biden administration is committed to the idea of a two-state solution, which is becoming more meaningful as we anticipate another administration that may not be. Biden has been investing a lot of efforts to produce diplomatic arrangements, both in Gaza and Lebanon throughout the year, but until now unsuccessfully. While on Gaza, the chances of progress seem very distant at the moment because of the gaps between what the Americans want to see and the Israelis and Hamas, each one in his own positions. On Lebanon, there seems to be a chance for convergence, in which the different parties involved want to see some way to wrap the war up. And if the Biden mediation, led by Envoy Amos Hochstein, can take this opportunity and produce a meaningful arrangement that sides could buy into, I think from the Israeli side at least, there will be satisfaction about that happening. And I think the next administration will also be happy to see it happen before it takes office. So that's one aspect. And the second aspect is to make another effort at least to bring the Israeli hostages back home from Hamas. And if you cannot bring them all, focus on those with dual American-Israeli citizenship, and the administration can bring at least them back to safety.
I want to get your thoughts here as well. In his post-election address, President Biden said he would use his final days in office to reach ceasefires in Lebanon and Gaza. The administration's track record so far on that front hasn't been great. They've kind of overpromised and underdelivered. How likely it is, do you think, that they'll be able to make real headway there?
Well, I would say that the administration was largely missing from the scene even before October 7th, 23. I was talking to a colleague of mine recently, and we were trying to come up with a meaningful statement policy the Biden administration kind of introduced, and we couldn't come up with one, not something significant that had long-term implications. So I'm a bit skeptic and a bit pessimistic about its ability to execute something in the remaining 2+ months until the inauguration of Donald Trump in January 2025. And I would argue that perhaps, possibly something short-term such as preliminary agreements on dual citizenship hostages, but nothing more than that. It seems like that there's some optimism in the region about the possible potential agreement with the Lebanese government, but the ability to actually formulate, sign it, and execute it successfully, in my view, is pretty much in doubt.
Remember, one of the major criticisms of the Biden administration since the start of the war in Gaza has been its perceived unwillingness to use its leverage to bring about real change, especially on Israeli policy. And especially when it comes to this issue of providing military assistance. We saw that same dynamic play out again this week with the 30-day deadline of the Austin Blinken letter, which was basically asking Israel to significantly increase the flow of aid into Gaza, which is facing an increasingly dire humanitarian situation. What are your takeaways on how that dynamic has played out, and how should the U.S., in your view, use its leverage more effectively?
Acknowledging that the US has leverage over Israel is an important point by its own, because throughout the year of war in Gaza, many voices here in the States were claiming that the leverage is gone. and the US cannot impact Netanyahu or the Israeli policies. But when those point of time in which there was a clear American interest at play and the US was determined to make an impact on the course of events, we saw American leverage impacting, influencing Israeli policy choices. Not to the extent that some people may want to see, but definitely on issues related to humanitarian aid, to the Rafah operation, to responses towards Iran, maybe also in Lebanon. So the US has leverage. And if the US wants Israel to go to a certain position, it can impact and make that happen. When you ask about the military aspect and deliveries, I think that's several steps ahead, because we didn't even get an American messaging on who is to blame for the failure of the hostage release and ceasefire negotiations. In the Israeli debate, many people put the blame on Netanyahu. Now, there were different opportunities to find a deal from February and March until today, whether small, whether big, that Netanyahu played around with and basically prevented. And that's common knowledge in Israel, even within the Netanyahu camp. But when we hear the American messaging, it's telling it a very different story. It's putting the blame on Hamas, even after the elections. Okay, so that rhetoric didn't change before and after the elections here. So using leverage is first by communicating clearly what's been happening. Why did efforts fail? Who's to blame? What should be done differently? What's the prospects for Israel if it chooses a different path? Stricter measures like the military equipment, I see it a bit difficult to envision how the US actually plays along with that.
Let's turn now to the incoming Trump administration. Ilai, to begin with, how has Trump's election victory been perceived in Israel?
Well, I think he's extremely popular in Israel. I think he would win the prime ministership if he ran for office in Israel. I think he's more popular than Benjamin Netanyahu, certainly. I think Israel is one of the most supportive of Trump compared to the other countries in the Middle East, certainly. But I would say also worldwide. I think Israelis are seeing and perceiving Trump as a better friend to Israel than Biden was. I think that they assume that once he returns to power, once he's inaugurated here in the United States in early 25, then things will change for the better as far as they're concerned. I think he's extremely popular. I think there's a lot of optimism there. You can see it not only within the prime minister's office. Benjamin Netanyahu was playing for time for a long time. He was really, really anxious to see who won the presidential elections, and I think he bet on the right horse, so to speak. I think that also major constituencies within the right-wing government are very happy. Settlers are elated. They are talking about that. They are posting about that. They are tweeting about that. The Israeli Minister of Finance, a very influential figure within the Israeli cabinet as well as in the Israeli public sphere, argued that 2025 will be the year of Israeli sovereignty or annexation over the West Bank, for example. And certainly there are some plans, some visions about resettling in the Gaza Strip as well.
Nimrod, just on that same point, what's struck you about the kind of response from key Israeli political actors to this news?
We saw the polls before the election, the polls in Israel, not the polls in the States. And I think it was more than 65% of Israelis supporting Trump. And it was quite hard to believe, okay? Because it's not only about the concept of a friend of Israel. Who is pro-Israeli? What does it mean to be pro-Israel? Was Trump really pro-Israeli last time around? The steps that he take, whether it's the Golan recognition, the relocation of the embassy to Jerusalem, the peace plan, did they improve Israel's diplomatic and security situation? I well recall how different regional relations were damaged in May of 2018, I think, when the embassy was relocated. But many were doing that because they were frustrated also by the Biden failure on ending the war. So you had the right wing supporting Trump, but you had the center and the left, some of them saying, well, Biden didn't deliver on what is important for us. But now those people, when they see not only Trump, but the people he's appointing to key positions related to Israel in the region, I think some of them have question marks on their previous preferences. And those who hope Trump will help deliver peace now may see Trump help deliver annexation. And that's not something we want to see.
No, we'll get into a few of the key kind of names in a bit more detail in a moment. But Ilai, I want to turn to you. What are your sort of expectations for post-January 20th when Trump takes office? How do you see U.S.-Israel relations changing? And what's your kind of outlook for the bilateral relationship in 2025?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Well, you can look at it from at least two key perspectives. One is kind of the long-standing relationship between the two, the bipartisanship that was somewhat lost after 2015. But certainly you can talk about the institutional, kind of the alliance in and of itself. But you can talk about the personalities. There's a lot to do with the chemistry between the two leaders. And so, again, I'm going to go back to the point of Trump being elected. And as Nimrod said, kind of the most popular, certainly when compared to Kamala Harris's candidacy. I think that there's a lot to do with what he will decide and the way that he would like to convey that policy to the Israelis. I think that Trump, and again, I'm a big believer in leadership, but also in political psychology. So I think it's a lot to do with his psychological state of mind, so to speak. And by that, I mean that he's a very transactional individual. So the optimism that we just talked about among some major right-wing circles in Israel, Bezalel Smotrich, Minister Ben-Gvir, and perhaps even Benjamin Netanyahu, I think that are largely overstated or too early to call. I think we'll have to wait and see how he envisions his administration. We don't know yet. We saw some of the appointments or the earmarked individuals to hold some kind of position in the administration, but we don't know. And again, people know him, so they will know how to manage him to some extent, to a large extent perhaps. Certainly some of the regional actors. And I think that they will do their best to try and pressure him in these points that they find these kind of weak points that he has about his image, perhaps the legacy element, the art of the deal coming to fruition, finally, ultimately in the Middle East. We'll have to wait and see.
Nimrod, building on that, I would say Trump and Netanyahu have had a complicated relationship. Trump is notoriously mercurial, transactional, but the two had a kind of a close relationship, I would say, during the first term, and then they kind of subsequently had some issues over which they fell out, including the Netanyahu's recognition of Biden's victory. Is that all water under the bridge now? What's your kind of read on the current state of the relationship, and how do you see that playing out?
Way under the bridge. We saw it when Netanyahu visited Washington several months ago. And you can compare even the optics. He met Biden, he met Harris, he met Trump. Not only the messaging, but how those meetings looked like. And it was a very clear reflection. I think both sides, both Biden and Netanyahu and Trump, each one conveyed their own message. And for Trump, it was important to show to his potential voters that he is on the side of Israel. Bashing the Biden administration for not being supportive enough. For Netanyahu, it was an emphasis that they are in good terms and that you can trust Netanyahu, because if there is an American president that is on the side of Netanyahu, then maybe it means that Netanyahu should continue in office in Israel, because he's the one that knows the American public, that knows the American discourse. You mentioned how Trump is more popular in Israel than Netanyahu. Some in Israel would say that Netanyahu may be more popular in the States by many. That was the common Israeli argumentation. So I think they're in good terms. I don't think there will be a major clash between both. Netanyahu doesn't see it only about Trump, but also about the Republican establishment taking control of the Senate, of the House, surrounding Trump. So I think he's very comfortable with what he sees, and he perceived it as a green light to go ahead with his policies on most major issues that he's advancing.
Ilai, this week we've also seen news about new diplomatic representation on both sides, both a new Israeli ambassador to the U.S. as well as just recently the news about the new prospective U.S. ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, who people may know from his time as governor of Arkansas. He's evangelical and been a fairly strong opponent of a two-state solution. How significant do you think those two choices are?
They're significant and insignificant at the same time. I think there's some dualism there. On the one hand, you're absolutely correct. The views, the opinions, the ideologies of not only Huckabee, but also Marco Rubio, who's designated to be the Secretary of State, my apologies, which means that there's not going to be any disengagement from the Middle East in the near future. I think that isolationism, which was kind of a major concern of many of the U.S.'s partners around the world, I think that will not be the case for the Middle East. At the same time, the fact that he appointed them based on a degree of loyalty, I think this is the main criteria for Trump, means that he will have absolute control over the content of the policy that they will enact at the end of the day. So he is planning to appoint trustworthy, as far as that is the indicator, trustworthy in terms of to what extent can I trust them, to what extent they are loyal to me. And in that regard, they will be very efficient and very dependable on his approval. And as a result of that, they will be great communicators of the policy coming out from the White House, regardless of what that policy actually looks like.
Nimrod, I want to turn next from the kind of bilateral relationship to the Israeli domestic political landscape. There's been quite a lot of speculation previously that the government, we might see early elections, that Netanyahu could be in a weaker position. But between the recent sacking of the defense minister and Trump's victory, do you think Netanyahu has really managed to shore up his position domestically?
From the political side, yes. From the public side, no. Okay, so Netanyahu is a master of politics. We know it. He is prioritizing political survival since day one of the war and even before. That's something that Israelis are critical of him because all is calculated according to what will serve his political benefits, not the national interest, perhaps. We see now investigations in Israel about all kind of leaks, pressures, forging of documents. That's, I think, something that will be quite big in shaping our political future. And the transition will happen. Israel has underwent such a trauma on October 7th and afterwards that I cannot imagine that skips the political spectrum and doesn't affect it. But yes, Netanyahu is trying to prolong that as much as possible. The elections are set for late 26. He did some political moves that enable him to increase his majority within the parliament. And there is a contrast between where the public is, 70+% want early elections, losing trust in the government. Only 20% support Netanyahu in the polls in terms of electoral behavior and the conditions within the parliament in which Netanyahu still has quite a grip on power and is not giving it away.
What do you see as the kind of potential scenarios for Israeli politics moving into 2025? And how might that impact the kind of scope or prospects for any sort of advancement on the two-state front?
Yeah, certainly. I think that one of the main reasons why the Biden administration was unable to promote its vision for the Middle East in general, and certainly the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in particular, even before October 7th, was the fact that the two political clocks were not aligned. Benjamin Netanyahu was constrained by its own coalition of his own volition. The coalition is extremely radical, right-wing. Members such as Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, but also others, prevented him, Benjamin Netanyahu, even if he wanted, and I'm not so sure that he wanted, to move forward towards a two-state solution or any accommodation of the Palestinian issue other than trying to manage the conflict, as he called it. I think that the political scene in Israel might change, as Nimrod commented just now, in case Benjamin Netanyahu's rule will be in danger. Either as a result of some of these affairs that have been transpired in the media recently, including the doctoring of some documents, leaking, extorting a senior Israeli military officer to achieve that goal. That might create the accumulative effect. Another issue is the inquiry of commission, an official one that may or may not be formed as a result of mostly public pressure because he has no political incentive to do that. He knows that this is kind of a political dead end for him because if they release a report that is critical of him, it will be very difficult for Benjamin Netanyahu to remain in power. And last but not least, there's a legal angle. He's been indicted in a number of cases that are being discussed now in the courts in Israel. In fact, his petition to ask for a delay of his own testimony was overruled, was rejected by the court earlier today. And as a result, there's a clock that is a legal clock that is also at play in this context. And we don't know what will happen, whether the judges will resume or will vigorously pursue that court case or court cases, plural, or not.
There's a lot of variables at work there, Nimrod, but what are your kind of expectations for the new year? And if we were to see early elections, how do you think the results would shake out? And could that lead to a significant change on the Israeli-Palestinian front?
One of the things that enables Israelis to feel more at ease at wanting a different leader is the sense that they will not be compromising their ideology. So the Israeli society has been moving to the right even more than it did before during the time of war. But still, those within the Israeli right that are not happy about Netanyahu's conduct, about the leadership, about his delivery of the war objectives, feel at ease because they can drop their vote from Netanyahu and move it to someone else, and still they will get a right-wing prime minister. So people are looking at a new right-wing party that may be established, that will be far away from the extremists of Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, that will not be corrupt and populist as Netanyahu, maybe something along the lines of what we saw from Naftali Bennett when he was prime minister, going back to the modality of a broader coalition that maybe has right-wing leadership, but also has centrist and maybe leftist components within it, that comes to heal the society, that comes to change the basic aspect that need to fix in Israel's domestic scene, external relations, not challenging democracy anymore. That coalition we had an experiment with. It was a good one, but it tried to bypass the Palestinian issue And the reason why it collapsed after such a short time is that you cannot bypass the Palestinian issue, like we saw in October 7th. So that will be a stumbling block. But the positive side of that is that even a moderate Israeli coalition that does not advance a two-state solution managed to improve ties with other regional actors like Jordan, like Egypt, like the Gulf, because it was reasonable. And reasonability is something we miss in the current leadership that we have.
Ilai, personnel is policy, as we say here in DC. Given all of the kind of variables that we've laid out here, the Netanyahu far-right government, the new characters that we're seeing coming in post-January 20th in Washington, do you think there's much cause for optimism on movement towards a two-state solution in the short term?
Yeah, well, I think it's the million-dollar question in a way. I think that, one of the things that I'm trying to focus on, certainly when I teach, and I'm a professor after all, is a concept called ripeness, this idea that people come together and realize that enough is enough. And I think that October 7th was certainly a potential trigger for this kind of reconceptualization of what enough is enough all about, and certainly about rethinking some of the axioms of Israeli policy and politics. And I think that Nimrod is right. I think that one other element is that Benjamin Netanyahu was, famous or infamous based on your perspective, but certainly in terms of trying to manage the conflict. And unfortunately, certainly the tragic side effect of October 7th is that you can't manage the conflict over time. It needs to be resolved one way or another. And again, there's open ways to resolve it or try to hypothesize or to imagine what it looks like, but certainly managing the conflict over time is impossible. And I think that certainly in that regard, there's some sense of optimism that you can draw after a very, very difficult, tragic year post-October 7th, both for Israelis and Palestinians. My hope is that with some moderation, with some space that allows for both Israelis, Palestinians, as well as international actors, first and foremost the United States administration, to try and rethink some of the possibilities, some of the what is within reach, what is not, and try to work towards something that is more hopeful at the end of the day, long term.
Nimrod, anything to add on that point?
I like the optimism. I think optimism is important in diplomacy and public engagement. Unfortunately, while I agree that the Israeli public now acknowledges the need to deal with the Palestinian issue and that you cannot go back to previous policies and hope for better success, that is not channeled yet into support of the two-state solution. And the support of the two-state solution in the Israeli public has been dropping, I think on the Palestinian public as well. Not because people see another solution, but because they sense that no solution is possible at all. A sense of helplessness of the crisis is so big, we are bound for never-ending wars. The other side is an internal conflict, an enemy basically. So that's one aspect of the mindset that is changing. And that's when you couple that into the linkage between the societies, the divide between them, the lack of communication channels, the limited amount of dialogue projects and civil society interaction, even business interaction that used to be bigger in the past. And when you add even something more to that recipe that is Israeli continued presence in the Gaza Strip, that is something that we are likely to see, all of that takes us back 20 years ago. So we are back to the days of the Second Intifada, before the Israeli disengagement of Gaza, that the next step to be discussed in international diplomacy was about taking Israel out of Gaza. It will not be about a two-state solution. It will not be about Palestinian reunification. That will be the first step. It enables a bit more playing cards for Israel when it tries to negotiate normalization with the Saudis, because it can give up on presence on Gaza, but it will not give up on its objection to a two-state solution. So two-state solution is currently a bit far away, but we need to continuously, slowly make progress towards it.
Ilai, you want to add something there?
Yeah, I wanted to add something about it. I just recently completed a article manuscript about the 1973 war and U.S. efforts to try to broker Arab-Israeli peace. And again, I think that the perception at the time was so stark, was so pessimistic, to use Nimrod's words at the time. The Egyptians attacking Israel on the holiest day on the Jewish calendar, a surprise attack, the number of people killed on the first day of the war. Not civilians for the most part, certainly, but certainly the numbers were very, very significant. But nevertheless, there was an understanding that something needs to give, something needs to change. And I completely agree with Nimrod. I think from 73 to 78 to 76 to 79, you had some preliminary intermediary steps, for example, disengagement agreements, both with Syria as well as with Egypt, and they provided kind of the diplomatic, political space for leaders to kind of to chime in. And I think it's about leaders in a great deal of cases. And 1973 provides kind of a blueprint, perhaps. Anwar Sadat, the Egyptian president at the time, makes this very unconventional gesture and comes and speaks in the Israeli Knesset, which changes public opinion. So I think that something dramatic, something that can happen with an American president, perhaps even Biden, before he leaves office, to give a speech in the Israeli Knesset, kind of acknowledging or kind of articulating a vision for the region, or perhaps even Trump. You want to make the deal, come to the region, make the pitch, make the deal, and that might change attitudes in the region, both for the Israelis and Palestinians.
Just building on that, Nimrod, I think one thing we can certainly say about Trump is he loves deals and he is hard to predict. Is there a scenario along the lines of what Ilai was referring to, where maybe he dusts off the previous Middle East peace plan, he pushes for some sort of a bigger and better U.S., Saudi, Israel deal with a real Palestinian component? Are those plausible to you, or are there other kind of hard to predict scenarios that you might envision?
Yeah, so it's difficult to predict, as you mentioned, and that's given. Even if he goes back to the Trump peace deal, that is something that moderates may want him to do, because I say it's better than endorsing annexation. That plan failed big time. Okay, so it wasn't a plan that envisioned a solution that could be accepted by the Palestinian national movement and by a majority of Israelis. So that's not a solution. That deal was a thing devised it took 2 or 3 years, in which everybody was anticipating what will be in the deal, and all the international community was sitting back and watching, and eventually it produced something that is not realistic at all. So even if there's another attempt to do something along these lines, I don't see it coming up with the real deal. And we know the formula, because you do not need to invent what a two-state solution will look like. We know the formula. That's the big asset of this reality, that all the plans are on the table. You need a political will, and I think in Israel you do not have that. In the White House, I don't think you will have that. The Palestinian leadership will likely to change as well. I do see Trump putting an effort on Israel-Saudi normalization, and I think he can make achievements over there, even if there are no real breakthroughs on the Palestinian front, because the calculation of the different actors involved in that do not prioritize the Palestinian issue from all the sides around.
I guess where does that leave other regional actors, entities like the EU that want to work to advance things? Where do they go at that point?
Well, both Nimrod and I have a significant experience with the EU as a political entity in the past. I think the EU is struggling in and of itself. Brexit, NATO as a kind of a security component. Certainly the EU's foreign and security policy posture has been challenging at best for many, many decades now. But they're trying. And I think that if there's a significant vacuum and there's a significant will, which I'm not sure exists in Europe, they might kind of draw themselves voluntarily or not into that scene. But I think that, some of the conversations I've heard in the past kind of allude to the fact that this is a regional crisis, and as a result, the region should come up with a solution. And certainly the Saudis are kind of the primary candidates to carry that mantle, given the fact that both they introduced a Saudi peace deal back in 2002, and kind of it was reframed and reintroduced as the Saudi plan at the time, multiple times during Arab League summits. And normalization, certainly from their perspective, will have to include a significant, robust Palestinian component. Certainly given the fact that post-October 7th, 23, the plight of the Palestinians, public opinion across the Middle East, that has increased the price of the Saudis for normalizing the relationship with Israel and signing the security pact with the United States.
Nimrod, where does that leave the potential role for Gulf actors?
Gulf actors are important, okay? Partly because their commitment to the relationship with Israel. Despite all the tensions, all the war, we saw the UAE, we saw Bahrain, committed to engaging with Israelis and continuing. They do seek an engagement on the Palestinian front, not necessarily with the current Palestinian leadership. So there is an issue, and we saw the UAE engage with the Israeli government and maybe with American officials on devising the plan for the governance of Gaza in the day after. That plan was rejected by the Palestinian Authority. So whatever investment of the Gulf in the Palestinian issue, in Gaza, in the peace process, we need to make sure that there is alignment between Ramallah and the Gulf. Because if the goal will be eventually to find a Palestinian who may replace the Palestinian Authority in a back door coming through Gaza, establishing a transition governance model in Gaza that will later on take over Ramallah, I don't think that's what we want to see in terms of advancing the two-state solution. So the Gulf states have a role to play. I don't think they will be the major drivers for a two-state solution because they have their own interest. I would look at Egypt, I would look at Jordan, the two immediate neighbors that are concerned the most by the continuation of the conflict. Egypt has been mediating throughout the year for hostage release, for ceasefire. Jordan has not. It was been taking like a normative position against Israel, but I think that's not enough. Jordan has supported mediation between Israel and the Palestinians in the past, and it should kind of reframe its positioning and go back to the diplomatic activism.
We're running short on time, and we've covered a lot of ground here today. But before we wrap up, I want to get both of your final thoughts, maybe starting with you, Ilai.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, I think that we've learned that Trump is very unpredictable. We don't know what he has in mind. I don't know if he has a vision for his administration, certainly in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian, Israeli-Arab conflict. Only time will tell. Yogi Berra famously said that prediction about the future is very difficult, if not impossible, or something to that effect. I think that that's absolutely correct, and we'll have to wait and see. There's a lot of plans that were enacted during the Trump administration time, the Abraham Accords. There's the ultimate deal, the deal of the century that he introduced was, as Nimrod argued, was a non-starter from the get-go as far as the Palestinians are concerned. Challenges are different. The situation is different. The circumstances are different. The past year was extremely difficult for both Israelis and Palestinians. And despite the fact that I am still optimistic because I think it's the right way to think about the future of the Middle East, it will be very, very difficult to find a path forward. There are a lot of actors that are looking forward to a Trump administration and others that are reluctant to engage. We'll have to wait and see how the administration and how the president himself kind of threads the needle in that context.
Nimrod, you've got the last word here.
I see the two-state solution and the end of the war, both in Gaza and Lebanon, as a key national interest of Israel. And we need to remember that when you evaluate the different actors and their roles. Traditionally, we are looking at the U.S. impact and the impact of current leaders. But I think what we have now is the leadership, including in Israel, that is not going there, and also the U.S. role, which may not be as decisive as it was in the past. So with all the discussion about Trump, it could very well be that what happens in our region will not be dictated by Washington. You mentioned, Ilai, the 70s and the peace process between Israel and Egypt. It began by secret talks between Israeli and Egyptian officials. So did the Israeli-Jordanian talks. So was the Oslo process. So it should come from our own societies, not by our current leaders, but from those actors within the Israeli, within the Palestinian, within the regional countries that are advocates for peace, that have capacity to impact policy, and that have aspiration for future leadership. Because the leadership that we have now, at least in Israel, may not be the one that we'll have in 1 year's time. And we need to make sure that once a new leadership comes into place, it's well fit into advancing positive progress. So all kind of back channel talks and channels and policy planning and empowering the moderates could be the way to go in such a difficult political situation.
We'll have to leave things there for now, but Nimrod, Ilai, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.
That's all the time we have for this week. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in and to our production team for all of their work on this week's episode. For the latest MEI coverage of Israel-Palestine, please visit our website at www.mei.edu. You can follow MEI on X, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events. I'm Alistair Taylor. We will see all of you next week.